To build a game in Unreal Engine with C++, you need to set up Visual Studio. Otherwise, you will not be able to create a C++ project. So let's go to the official Visual Studio downloads page and click on the free download button under where it says Community. Open up the setup executable file that was just downloaded, and this will install the Visual Studio installer. Once the installer has been installed, it should open up. If it didn't, then start it up. And if you don't see the screen after opening the installer, click on the Available tab, and then click the Install button by where it says Visual Studio Community 2022. In terms of what parts of Visual Studio you need to install, always refer to the official Unreal Engine documentation. Here, select the version of the engine that you are working with. In this video, I'm only covering Unreal Engine 5 because the latest version of Visual Studio 2022 at the moment is only compatible with UE5. Setting up older versions of Visual Studio for UE4 will be covered in a separate video. But if we scroll down, you should see some information about what workloads to install. So for Unreal Engine 5.6, we need .NET Multi-Platform App UI Development, .NET Desktop Development with C++, and Game Development with C++. Going back to the documentation, you should see information below about other components to include with your installation. The most notable ones, if you go back to the installer and expand where it says Game Development with C++, are MSVC, aka C++ Build Tools, C++ Profiling Tools, C++ Address Sanitizer, Windows 10 or 11 SDK, and Unreal Engine Installer. Make sure to include the other ones from the screenshot in the docs as well. If any of the components from the screenshot aren't showing up here, then look them up in the Individual Components tab. It's also possible that by the time you're watching this, the screenshots in the docs are outdated, so the components or even workloads may no longer exist. Once you've configured your installation to mimic that of the documentation, go ahead and click Install. This installation will take a while, so please like and subscribe if you are enjoying the video. Once Visual Studio has been installed, it should have opened up automatically. If not, don't worry because we're actually going to close this out and revisit it later. If you accidentally forgot to install a component or you installed the wrong component, you can always modify your Visual Studio installation and select what you need or deselect what you don't need. For now, we are going to create a new C++ project or open an existing one in Visual Studio. So close out the installer, and I'm assuming that you have the engine installed. If not, we have a video on that. But go ahead, launch or restart the editor, select any project template, select C++, and hit create. Once the project has been created, it should have opened up in Unreal Engine, and so should Visual Studio. If Visual Studio did not open up on its own, go to where the project is located in File Explorer and double-click the Visual Studio solution file. If you don't see a Visual Studio solution file, perhaps you've downloaded a C++ project from GitHub or somewhere else. In that case, right-click the U project file in File Explorer, click Show More Options, and then click Generate Visual Studio Project Files. Note that if you are working with a blueprint-only project, aka no source folder here, you can only build a project in Visual Studio if there is C++ code. So you can add some to your project by opening up your project in the editor, going to Tools up here, and creating a new C++ class. You can also do what we just talked about right below, generating Visual Studio project files, as well as opening the project in Visual Studio. If you didn't see the option to open your project in Visual Studio, then make sure that in your editor preferences, specifically in the source code settings, that the editor selected is Visual Studio. Going back to Visual Studio though, you may or may not see this prompt to log in. If you don't see this, then that means you've logged in before, so don't worry. But if you do see this, then yes, you have to log in, because although it gives you this option to skip this step now, eventually you will be unable to use Visual Studio if you don't sign in. So create an account if you don't have one, or sign in if you do. After signing in, you may see this prompt about Copilot. I'm going to skip this step now and reserve it for a separate video. When the IDE opens up, make sure that you have the Solution Explorer tab selected either on the bottom left or right. If you don't even see the tab, then go up here to View Solution Explorer. And then you should see either on the top left or top right this yellow notification saying that you might need to install extra components. Now, if you don't see this warning pop up, maybe this is a project downloaded from GitHub or somewhere else, or you did see this pop up before and you pressed X instead of install. Please don't do that, and now you want it to reappear. So if I go back to the project in File Explorer, make sure that you have View, Show, Hidden Items on, and look for this .vsconfig file. This is what the vsconfig file looks like, but it basically outlines all the suggested components for the project. If you don't have this file, then create a new C++ Unreal project like we just did, copy the vsconfig file from that project over to the one you are working with, and then close Visual Studio, delete this .vs folder, and relaunch the Visual Studio solution file. After doing all of that and you still don't see this warning notification, then you probably have everything you need in Visual Studio for Unreal Engine. But clearly I'm missing some things, so I'm going to click install and that will relaunch the Visual Studio installer. With the components to install pre-selected, and click install again. Once that's done, that should have relaunched the project in Visual Studio. Again, if it didn't, then just manually relaunch it. Before we actually build this project to make sure everything is set up correctly, let's go back to the Unreal Engine documentation because it has some recommended settings. Go ahead and follow the instructions from the recommended settings section of the doc top to bottom. They're pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go over all of these settings in details. I have a sticky note here on the left explaining a couple of them as I fast forward through the process. Once that's done, let's finally build our C++ code. Make sure that you have the development editor configuration and Win64 platform selected up here. But before we build, by default in Unreal Engine in the editor preferences, there is a setting called live coding that is enabled. While this is on, you can't build your project in Visual Studio while the project is also open in the editor. Unless you really want to build in Visual Studio while the editor is open, I actually recommend keeping these default settings since turning them off will enable what's called hot reload, which has been known to corrupt blueprints. For this video and this first build, I'm going to close the editor just to show you what it looks like to build in Visual Studio. Now right-click your project, not the engine, in Solution Explorer under where it says Games and select Build. You should see this output window pop up down here showing the build logs indicating whether the build failed or not. If you don't see this, then go to View and click on Output. If the build succeeded, then let's relaunch the project in the editor. You can do this by double-clicking the uProject file, or you can do it through Visual Studio. Let's do it through Visual Studio. Once again, right-click your project, but this time select Set as Startup Project, and then either press F5 or click the green arrow button labeled Local Windows Debugger. Once the editor has started up, let's triple-check everything by actually playing the game. Now let's say you want to make some code changes right now while the editor and Visual Studio are both open simultaneously. This is where that live coding feature comes in. So you don't have to follow what I'm doing right now, just watch, but I'm going to go back to Visual Studio via Alt-Tab to modify some code to print out a message onto the screen when I play the game. Then I'm going to save my changes by pressing Ctrl-Shift-S, then go back to the editor and quit the game by pressing Escape. Press Ctrl-Alt F11 on your keyboard all at the same time to build the project C++ code from the editor. And if we run the game again, this time with Alt-P instead of the green arrow button, doesn't matter, we should see my code changes in action when my character is moving. You can see where it says Hello World on the top left corner. And for this live coding feature, you don't need to run the editor through Visual Studio. I'm just showing you how to do this to prepare you for eventually debugging your game with Visual Studio by setting breakpoints and stepping through lines of code. If you didn't understand anything I just said, don't worry, we're going to cover all of that in another video. And technically that's it for setting up Visual Studio for Unreal Engine. Don't forget to quit this Visual Studio debugging session when you're done by either pressing Shift F5 or clicking the red square button. And please like, comment, and subscribe if you found the video helpful. Before I close out the video, I'm just going to cover two more things. The first one is if you want to double check that you installed every component that I did in this video, you can go to our GitHub repo and download this .vsconfig file. Then go back to the installer, select More by your installation, click on Import Configuration, browse for that .vsconfig file that we just downloaded, and now you will have the option to install whatever you're missing. The last thing I want to cover are settings in Visual Studio that were not part of the recommended settings in the Unreal Engine docs, but I personally recommend these for developer productivity reasons. This video will have a pinned comment explaining those other settings. But if you want to use the settings that I use in Visual Studio, then go back to that GitHub repo and download this .vs settings file. Go back to Visual Studio, click Tools, Import and Export Settings, import selected environment settings, select the location to store your current settings if you ever want to go back to them, and then browse for the VS settings file that we just downloaded. Click Finish, and your IDE should look a little different now. And lastly, feel free to modify that GitHub repo or comment down below if you have any suggestions for configurations or settings for Visual Studio for Unreal Engine. For now, that is all. Please follow us on our other social media pages, join the Discord server, support the channel like our higher tiered patrons Lucas Moskin and Morgan Heidemann, and have a nice day.